Alright, so I just had a couple more things from chapter 32 that I wanted to go over before you finish that chapter, and here is the video for it. So where we ended today in class is we were talking about these electromagnetic waves. They have the form of a traveling wave, so they should look somewhat familiar, where we have, the cosine kx minus omega t form for a traveling wave, but we have a form for the electric field and the magnetic field. And basically what we're saying is that these varying electric fields and magnetic fields are what constitute light. So light is sort of a shorthand for what we might also call electromagnetic radiation, which is these traveling waves that go through space. They travel with the speed of light, and they consist of these electric fields and magnetic fields that were predicted by Maxwell's equations, or are consistent with it. So when we get into that idea of light being a wave, as we saw those traveling wave expressions, we have the ability now to sort of have a deeper understanding of different types of radiation that you're probably familiar with. So they all fall into what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. And so what these are different types of electromagnetic waves, but what makes them different from each other is that they have different wavelengths and frequencies. And what makes them unified is they all are basically the same electric and magnetic fields that we were looking at, but when we look at the details of those traveling wave expressions, we would find that they would have different wavelengths and frequencies, remembering that the way that the wavelength and frequency are related is through the speed of light, so that the product of the frequency and the wavelength give us the speed of light. The electromagnetic spectrum is when we talk about all the different types of radiation, going from gamma rays, which we see right here, which are at the highest frequency and the shortest wavelengths, and going all the way down to radio waves, which have the longest wavelengths and the lowest frequencies. And then what's really sort of interesting is that this little region right in here actually represents what we would know as our visible light. And visible light are the light that we can see with our eyes. So it turns out that gamma rays and infrared rays and microwaves really have the same origin as the light that we can see. It's just that our eyes can't detect it. When we're talking about visible light, of course, we have the colors Roy G. Biv. We sort of just talk about the two ends of the spectrum, the red end and the blue end, where at the blue or violet end we have the shortest wavelengths of light of around 400 nanometers. Remember that 1 nanometer is 10 to the minus 9 meters. And then at the red end, those are the longest wavelengths of light that we can detect with our eye, that are around 700 nanometers. So in general, we usually say that we can see between between 400 and 700 nanometers. And here is a little table that further sort of breaks down the different wavelengths of the different colors of light. You might recognize these. These are the colors of the rainbow. So if we are talking about the question here, we have in a vacuum, one color of red light has a wavelength of 700 nanometers, and one color of violet light has a wavelength of 400 nanometers. This means that in a vacuum, the red light, we want to ask our question, does it have a higher frequency and travels faster than the violet? Does it have a higher frequency and travels slower? Does it have a lower frequency and travel faster? Does it have a lower frequency and travel slower? Or are none of these answers above? And this is where one of the things that I always tell you doesn't work this time, because these all travel at the speed of light, which is equal to c. So none of these are correct, because they're all saying that some of these are traveling faster or slower than the others. So our answer is actually none of the above. And so the last sort of idea of what we're going to look at in this chapter is the idea of what we call the pointing vector, which is talking about, sort of what is the wave carrying with it when it's traveling. It's actually carrying energy with it. And so first of all, we want to sort of think about our source of electromagnetic waves is at some point, but then as the waves travel out from that initial point, remember that could have been like a vibrating charge, but as the waves travel out, they're going to go out in all different directions. They're actually going to go out in three-dimensional space, so they're going to be covering a larger and larger sphere as they travel. And as we think about that, what are they bringing with them? They're bringing energy. And the way that we've ended up sort of defining this flow of energy is through what we call the pointing vector, which is defined as the power per unit area. But remember that power is energy per unit time. So in a way, this pointing vector is like a measurement of flux. And notice that the direction of the pointing vector is the same direction as the speed or the propagation of the wave, which should make sense. And we express the pointing vector as the cross product of the electric field and the magnetic field over mu naught. So basically, when we're talking about a wave traveling through space, the pointing vector talks about how much energy per unit time, per unit area is that wave bringing with it. Now, one of the things that we might be more interested in is what we call the intensity, which is just the energy per area times time. But it's really, we're looking at the average value of the pointing vector. And so if we wanted to figure out what the average value is of it, we could keep in mind that S is 1 over mu naught E cross B. And if we assume that these are perpendicular to each other, we can write it as E max cosine of kx minus omega t times B max times cosine kx minus omega t all over mu naught, which could be written as E max B max cosine squared of kx minus omega t over mu naught. And if we look at the average of this, the average value really only comes from what is the average value of this cosine squared term, which is the only thing that's changing with time. Everything else is a constant. So the average value of that is 1/2. So S average, which is the intensity, can just be written as E max B max over 2 mu naught. And that's how we find the average value or the intensity of the wave. We can actually write this a lot of different ways. So again, if we say the intensity, which is the average pointing vector, is equal to E max B max over 2 mu naught, we can actually use the fact that E over B is equal to the speed of light. And we can write this, like we might just want to write this in terms of the electric field or just in terms of the magnetic field. And so we can sort of write this in a lot of different ways using this, and also using that C is equal to 1 over the square root of epsilon naught mu naught. So using that, we could write this as EM squared over 2 mu naught C, which could be also written as 1/2 the square root of epsilon naught over mu naught Emax squared, which is equal to 1/2 C epsilon naught Emax squared. So there's lots of different ways we can write this, and this is just in terms of the electric field. And we could do the same thing with the magnetic field. So it basically would be whatever is convenient, but keep in mind we're using these relationships and starting with this. And so here we have that. So let's look at an example. We have a 75-watt incandescent light bulb is a sphere of 6 centimeters in diameter, but only 5% of that energy goes to visible light. So if, remember, the 75 watts is the power, and so the intensity is the power over the area. So it's 75 watts over the area. It's a sphere, so 4 pi r squared. We were told it was 6 centimeters in diameter, so it's only 3 centimeters in a radius. And that's going to tell us that overall the intensity would be equal to 6,631 watts per square meter. But only 5% is visible. So if we want to know the visible light intensity, we have to take 0.05 times that 6,631, and that gives us 332 watts per square meter. Then if we want to find what is the electric field associated with that, we can say, well, that intensity is equal to the max electric field over 2 mu naught C. So the electric field, max, is equal to the square root of I times 2 times mu naught times C. So if we put in our values for that, we get 500 volts per meter. And then using the fact that E over B is equal to C, we could write B is equal to E over C, and then we could use our value of E and get it as 1.7 times 10 to the minus 6 Tesla. And that's how we could do it. So that's pretty much it for this chapter, just a couple things that we didn't get to. And next time, after Easter, we will be ready to learn a little bit about the light, now that we know sort of how it originates.